I'm here at the Milford Cemetery, just south of Milford, Pennsylvania, right on the Delaware River. And I'm here to pay my respects to Mary Pinchot Meyer. And this is the Pinchot Mausoleum, where her uncle, former twice governor of Pennsylvania and Secretary of the Interior, Gifford Pinchot, is interred. And it took a little sleuthing. I didn't quite get any information from the internet, but I found that this was what the mausoleum looks like. And I think it's about the only one in the middle of the cemetery. And then over to the right is just a simple headstone for Mary Pinchot Meyer. She was murdered in Washington, D.C. 2 days before her 44th birthday, and less than a year after JFK was assassinated in 1963. And this is her son, who was killed in an accident. I don't know whether he was on a bike or in a car, but he was only 9 years old, Michael Pinchot Meyer. And she was married to Cord Meyer, and their marriage didn't last too much past when their son was killed. And she was a neighbor of the Kennedys when they lived in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. while he was a senator. And I won't go into the whole history here, but to me, she's an important person in history, and I'm a little dismayed that she just has a simple rectangular stone headstone here. But the Pinchot family was really some family. Mary's sister was married at one time to Ben Bradley, who was the editor of the Washington Post. And they were all friends with the Kennedys, and they all hung out together a lot. So JFK is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Also a simple grave, but very much visited. And Mary is alone here, next to her son, at least. But I'll talk more about Mary and her place in history. But just from what I've read about her, she sounds like somebody I would have liked to have known. And obviously JFK really enjoyed her company also. Mary Pinchot Meyer here in Milford Cemetery in Milford, Pennsylvania, on the Delaware River. This video and a set of videos I'm doing along with this one is about the woman who is buried in Milford Cemetery in Milford, Pennsylvania, Mary Pinchot Meyer. And I'll be talking a lot about JFK and their relationship together, a big topic. I'll be talking about Mary's shocking execution-style murder in Washington, D.C. 2 days before her 44th birthday in 1964, less than a year after JFK was assassinated. This will be a more in-depth look into Mary's life and death, not the Wikipedia version. I've read 5 books about her or that include sections about her. And I'm trying to distill everything that comes out of these books into a finite set of videos. But it's an expansive topic. So these are the three main books that I pulled information from. Nina Burleigh's A Very Private Woman, Peter Janney's Mary's Mosaic, and then there's a biography of the whole Pinchot family from the earliest generation up through Mary's generation by David Patterson. Very well-written book, very well-researched. All these books were very well-researched and exhaustive. And Peter Janney mentioned that he spent 30 years putting together his book. I'm sure he took breaks, but it was over a 30-year period that he finally produced this book that he always wanted to write. And he knew Mary Pinchot Meyer from when he was a young boy and played with one of her sons. So his history goes way back. I also read the entire book by Ben Bradley, who was Mary Pinchot Meyer's brother-in-law, married to her sister Antoinette, or Tony Bradley. And then Jesse Kornbluth did a novel about what Mary Meyer might have written in her diary, but he has a lot of factual nonfiction information in the book too, so it's well put together, gives extra insight. And then in researching for this set of videos, I've pulled up various articles, run across various articles in the internet and gain further perspective. But one thing I'll say is all of the books include pretty much the same small set of pictures, and they generally describe Mary as a beautiful, likable person, but it's really just the outline of a person. I don't feel like I totally know her the way people who knew her back during when she was growing up and into the 60s. So you can only get so much information from books, even if the authors have tried to get all the information they can. So the pictures you'll see in each of the books are pretty much the same small set of pictures. There's not a ton of pictures taken of her, but we'll use what we have to try to put together the story of her. Now, JFK is an interesting paradox of a person. He was extremely charismatic, my favorite American president, excellent public speaker, always gave a good speech, whether it was his inauguration or to a million people in Berlin and everything in between. He was just the kind of person people loved to go hear speak and were moved by. And JFK was used to a lot of people always being around him. He grew up in a big family. This shows all the kids in the family except for Teddy, who hadn't been born yet when this picture was taken. And it just created the environment where he enjoyed and was very used to being around a lot of people. And this extended into his adulthood and his siblings bringing in their spouses so that he had an even broader family. And he had started his own family. He had two small children. Jackie had had miscarriages and one stillborn baby. Their family could have been bigger, but they were attempting to increase the size of their family. Jackie was 12 years younger than JFK, so he lived until his mid-40s and she was still in her early 30s. He needed his family near him all the time, so he appointed Bobby Kennedy, his younger brother, to be the Attorney General, and he liked to make decisions by conferring with others. He ultimately made his own decisions, but he liked to get the opinions of other people. He wasn't going to come up with any decision in a vacuum. One thing that is interesting about his background is he's a person who liked to be around people all the time, but he went through periods both during his childhood and his young adulthood by himself because he was sickly or he had spinal problems, back problems. So as a child, he was starting to develop symptoms of what was later diagnosed as Addison's disease, but he would be sent off by his parents to a hospital like the Mayo Clinic and possibly other hospitals, but he would go for weeks or months at a time and just be alone. And I don't know if he got too many visits from his family. He was mostly, the only company he had were the hospital staff as a child. So he had a lot of alone time, learned to do a lot of reading and occupied himself that way. And he charmed all the nurses and the doctors in the hospitals even as a small boy. And then later on, on, he had very painful back surgeries. He had surgeries, I think, 3 different times, and they were touch and go, where the doctors didn't even know if he would survive the surgery. They were meant to correct problems he had with his back that he had injured playing football at Harvard or during World War II. Various things would aggravate his back, and so he tried surgery. It ultimately didn't totally solve his problems, so he always lived with back pain as an adult. But while he was recuperating from one of his surgeries, he wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book, Profiles in Courage. He had a lot of downtime, a lot of alone time. Jackie suggested to him that he spend his time doing something constructive, and so that's how he came to write the book, with a lot of help from his aide, Ted Sorensen. When he ultimately became president and was in the White House, of course, there's going to be tons of people around all the time, working in the executive offices and also staff to wait on him, and Secret Service everywhere. Jackie liked being a first lady up to a point, but then she needed her own space. She didn't want to be like a bird in a gilded cage. So one of the things she liked to do was horseback riding, and there wasn't a lot of room to do that at the White House. So they actually got an estate out in the country in Virginia where she could go horseback riding on weekends. And she also liked to travel and sort of do her own thing. She would do first lady type things like having teas and dinners up to a point, but she liked to have a lot of her own time. She spent most of her time at the White House, but a good chunk of her time away from the White House. So JFK was alone, and Jackie took the kids with her when she went away, and he was busy. He had a lot of work to do anyways, so it gave him more time to concentrate. But at night, he would still want to have company. He wasn't used to not having people around. So he'd get on the phone and call people to come over and have dinner with him. One of his favorite people, if not the favorite person he liked to have over, was Mary Pinchot Meyer. Mary was divorced. She had kids of her own, but they were usually away at prep school, so she was available. She lived in Georgetown, right near the White House. They knew each other from the Georgetown neighborhood and from earlier in their lives, which I'll go back into. And they enjoyed each other's company. And who knows what went on behind closed doors, but let's just say they enjoyed each other's company. So he would call her often, and she would come over. She would tell people sometimes that she might be able to do something with her friends, but if she got a call, she would have to break those plans, and she wouldn't say where she was going, but where she was going was the White House. So Nina Burleigh chose the title for her book, A Very Private Woman. So Mary didn't blab to her friends or hardly anyone that she was meeting with the president, going over to the White House, but it was kind of a secret that was in plain sight. It was right way out there. So JFK was the same. He was a private person who liked to have his own separate private life from what the public saw. So everybody has their own private lives, and not everybody is always in the public eye. So they have their own private lives. So was she very private? I don't think she was any more private than any of the rest of us would be. She was just a normal person, and they were both normal people. But in one case, JFK was very, very famous, but he was still a normal person. He and Jackie were both attractive people. Other people were attracted to them. In JFK's case, men and women were attracted to him. All kinds of people were, including celebrities like Angie Dickinson here and Barbra Streisand. And Jackie, with her wardrobe, her eye for fashion, being a style icon, an attractive woman in her own right, she was attractive to a lot of people. And she was so into fashion that she reportedly spent what today would be worth $400,000 to $500,000 a year on clothes, custom made for her by usually French designers and some American designers. And at the time, JFK made $100,000 a year as president. That salary, $100,000 a year in the early 1960s, would be worth about $1.1 million in today's dollars. So Jackie's fashion budget was a big chunk of their income. And he didn't always like to hear what she had spent on clothes and other things. So he was managing his own family budget while he was trying to manage the nation's budget at the same time. As I mentioned, everybody'd be away, the day would be over, and Jack would like to have some company. So he was a bachelor for a lot of the time in the White House, and he'd get on the phone and call a friend. He had a lot of women that he called, and if he called, they'd come over. They were excited to be the object of his attention, and he was also the president of the United States, so most women could not say no. Some of these women that I'm showing here did say no, but let me go through them. One of the things was he wasn't above having flings or affairs with people who worked for him, which today would be extremely frowned on. But this was back in the late 50s, early 60s, a different time. The youngest of many young women that were much younger, half his age or less than half his age, was Mimi Beardsley Alford. And he would have her come on trips when he would go away on trips, and he'd have her there to spend time with at night after all the festivities were over. And she wrote a very good book. I've read this book. It's very honest. It's good to read a book where you don't feel like somebody's actually trying to make money by making up stories. Like, this is a true story. She discusses, like several of the women discuss how they were very conflicted, and it wasn't good for them mentally or emotionally to be having an affair with not only a married man, but the president of the United States, and in many cases who was much older. And it affected their personal lives later in life, and they spent a lot of time in therapy trying to resolve what they had done earlier in their life. But one of the things about Mimi Beardsley is that she came to the White House. She was going to be like a summer intern, and on her first or second day, one of the president's assistants came over to her, Dave Powers, and asked her if she'd like to go for a swim during the middle of the day. And she was like, what? Okay. So she went with Dave Powers. He took her to the White House swimming pool, and she wound up being in the pool with the president. And from there on, the president wanted to have a fling with her. She was put in that situation, kind of thrown into the pool, as you'd say. And one of the things she did that I thought was really weird, there's a lot of weirdness that goes on, but he would have her massage oil into his hair so that his hair would look great. And he would ask her to come into the Oval Office and do that while he was sitting there working. And other people might be there, and she'd be doing this to him while he was having a meeting or something. So it was very weird. Anyway, moving on, Diane DeVay met JFK at a political event, and he got her a job in one of the federal agencies, and they had an affair for like 18 months. And I forget whether she called it off or he did, but a lot of times the women said they couldn't do this anymore, and JFK would go, okay, that's all right. So another woman, young woman, Pam Tanur, JFK had met while he was a senator, and they said that she looked the most like Jackie. And there is some of a resemblance, but you don't see that in most of the pictures, more so in this set of pictures. JFK said that Jackie should have her own press representative, so he got Pam Tanur the job to be Jackie's press secretary, which is kind of amazing, while still having a fling with her going on. Then moving over to the right, another set of women in their young 20s. They were known as Fiddle and Faddle, and they worked in JFK's secretary's office, and what they did nobody else knew, but they were just sort of around as fun girls, and they would be in the swimming pool. Like when Mimi Beardsley first went to the pool, Fiddle and Faddle were there, so in the pool with JFK, so she didn't feel as bad until like Fiddle and Faddle started showing up. So Jill Cowan was Faddle and Priscilla Ware was Fiddle. And one time Jackie was taking a French reporter around the White House, and Jackie spoke fluent French, and they came into the secretary's office outside of the Oval Office, and Fiddle and Faddle were there, and she said reportedly to the French reporter, said in French, "This is one of the women that my husband is sleeping with," so, or supposedly sleeping with. Everybody always thought, did Jackie know that JFK was having affairs with all these women, or somehow was she kept in the dark? I don't know. Maybe she didn't want to believe it. Anyway, another attractive young woman was Judith Inmore Campbell, and then her married name was Exner, and JFK was with her in her mid-20s. And one of the things that was concerning about her is that she also was the girlfriend of one of the top people in the mob, the mafia, Sam Giancana. So they were kind of sharing the same young woman. Anyway, now moving down to the bottom row, we're finally getting to women in their mid-20s. So Ellen Rometsch was from Germany, and I think she was from East Germany. And boy, what a beehive hairstyle she has in this picture. It's really hard to get pictures of some of these women. Like, there's just one picture out there, but this is the picture of her. And she supposedly was well known to a lot of people, political people in Washington, D.C., and was very popular. And JFK was enamored with her at one point too, and then there was some concern that she might be a spy, so she was deported back to Germany. The next woman, Enid Stanko, later on her married name was McGiffert. The only picture I could find of her is later in life. She's still an attractive woman, but I can only imagine what she looked like back in her 20s, and JFK was very interested in her. But I have to say, one thing that from what I've read about her is that she always said no. Like, JFK would go, "Can you come over?" And she goes, "I really don't think that's a good idea." And another time JFK goes, "I'm going to Bermuda. Would you like to come with me?" She goes, "You're the president and you're married. I really don't think that's a good idea." So he maintained a good relationship with her, and she would come to White House dinners. He would invite her, but they would never get together one-on-one. So good for her that she stuck up for principles. The next woman, Helen Chavez-D, I think that's a Hungarian name. It's her married name. Let's say Helen Houston, which was her maiden name. He knew her in her late 20s, and she, like Mary Meyer, was married to someone in the CIA and then divorced from that person. So Helen was a woman who would be relieved if JFK couldn't meet with her. Like, she felt guilty about doing it. She had small kids and everything. It was a juggling act, so not everyone felt comfortable. She enjoyed his company. She was flattered by his attention. All the women would say that he was very personable and would ask questions about themselves. He was not an insensitive person at all, but she just felt like it was wrong, and she was somewhat relieved when their relationship ended. Then we get to Jackie, who's actually one of the older ones in the group, but she was only in her early 30s when she became the first lady. And with Jackie, they had a complex relationship. When they were together, they were a great couple together. When they were apart, they didn't mind being on their own. And even in the White House, JFK was the last president to have a separate bedroom from his wife, from the first lady in the White House. And even when they had out in the country, they had homes, they preferred being in separate bedrooms at night. Sometimes JFK would go to her bedroom, or she would come to his, but they would have separate bedrooms. I've heard the only president since JFK that has separate bedrooms is Donald Trump. So a unique relationship, and one where supposedly they became closer and closer the longer they were married, but it took a long time to get to a more intimate level where they would actually hold hands or express some kind of public display of affection. They usually did not hold hands or do anything in public. And then Marilyn Monroe, we've heard about, that was more of a fling. Although Marilyn didn't want to be used, she wanted a relationship, and she supposedly even dreamed of replacing Jackie as the first lady. Wouldn't that be something if she was the first lady? But one of the things with Marilyn was that she could be obsessive about calling people, including in the middle of the night. And she lived in LA, so they were already 3 hours behind the East Coast, but it got to be a hassle. And she would call the White House, and then she knew Bobby Kennedy, so she would also call him, including at his office in the middle of the night. And it was something that was fun for a while, but just couldn't last. It became too intense. And then finally are the two Pinchot sisters, Tony Pinchot Bradley, who was the younger sister, and Mary Pinchot Meyer. Tony Bradley, sometimes the president would be interested in her, for example, at his 46th birthday party, even with Jackie there, with Mary there, with some of these other women there at the dinner. Supposedly, the story goes that Jack chased Tony into a bathroom and got a little grab-handed, but she rebuffed him. She resisted him. So she was another one who did not want to cross that line. She enjoyed his company, but she kept him at bay. And then Mary Pinchot Meyer, who, as I mentioned, was divorced. She was the oldest of the group, the closest to JFK in age. She's still about 3 to 4 years younger than JFK. And maybe it was because of her age and also her background, she was the one that JFK could relate to on the most levels, including, it can only be speculated, physical levels. So JFK had quite the harem at the White House. And I don't know how he did it, because he had a bad back. A lot of times he had to use crutches. He didn't like to be photographed using crutches, but he used them a lot when he was a senator and also when he was president, when his back would act up. One time his back acted up, he went up to Canada with Jackie, and one of the things they did in Ottawa with the Prime Minister of Canada was to plant a tree in memory of something. And so Jack actually took the shovel and dug the hole, or started to dig the hole, and then he pulled out his back doing so. And I think Jackie actually finished digging the hole and planting the tree, but he wound up being laid up from that. So there are different times that he needed the assistance of his crutches. Here he's holding a cigar while holding his crutches, got his hands full. And here's other times he's walking past some of his aides. On the left, it's Andrew Hatcher, his assistant press secretary. And on the right, the first person in the foreground, I think, is Larry O'Brien, one of his presidential assistants. He had to use those crutches a lot. So I don't know how he had the energy and physical ability to have relationships, including sexual relationships, with many women. He didn't like to go long without female company. The other thing he had going on, as I mentioned earlier, he started to have Addison's disease as a child, and then it doesn't go away, and you can treat it. And one of the things Addison's disease does, it does some serious things to your body. So it's not a pleasant disease to have, but one of the side effects of Addison's disease is it can give you a tanned appearance. So JFK actually would look more tan than the average person. He spent a lot of time down in Florida to work on his tan, but it could have been one of the things with Addison's disease, it can be blotchy. So I think he was maybe trying to even it out. And he was also using lotions to even out his coloring. But the overall effect was that he looked like the tannest guy in the room, the healthiest person. And really, he was not. He was probably the least healthy of the people, but he never complained about it. That's one thing they always say about JFK. Never complained about his maladies, his Addison's disease, or his bad back. He was a trooper. And maybe that played into his charisma, that you go through pain in order to come out the other side. So the earlier picture I showed of JFK with Mary Pinchot Meyer is the only picture that's out there, I believe, of him with any one of his girlfriends or mistresses or whatever you want to call them. And it was taken as part of a group shot on the right at the Pinchot estate, which was built by Mary's grandfather. And it's where they had several homes on the estate, and they're standing in front of the house that Mary's parents and she and her sister, as children growing up, spent a lot of time at during the summers. And in the group picture, the man on the left is Mary and Tony's cousin, Gifford Pinchot, who was the son of Gifford Pinchot, who was a former governor of Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of history of the Pinchot family, and there was a lot of wealth. So JFK came to the Pinchot estate called Gray Towers 2 months before he was assassinated, and I'll talk about that later in this set of videos. But here is the main house at the Gray Towers estate. It was built in 1886. It's a huge house. This is when JFK came to receive the gift of the house to the U.S. federal government from the Pinchot family. And they came up from Washington, D.C., and Mary and Tony came with the president on Air Force One. It landed at a nearby Air Force base, probably Stewart Air Force Base in New York. And then from there, they took a helicopter to Milford, Pennsylvania, where Gray Towers Estate is, for him to speak to a large crowd. And after he spoke through the crowd, Mary's cousin, Gifford Pinchot, gave a quick tour of the house, walked JFK through the main house. And this is the house today. You can go on a tour of it. It's very interesting. This is the room that Gifford Pinchot took JFK through, the main library sitting room. And this is where Milford, Pennsylvania is, on the extreme eastern end of Pennsylvania, on the Delaware River, across the Delaware River from New Jersey. And it's a beautiful, interesting site that you can visit, a National Historic Site. So let's take a look. So Grey Towers is designed in like a French chateau design. But the Pinchots originally were from France, so that makes sense. And I think that is Mary Pinchot Meyer's grandfather, James Pinchot. It's unusual to have a bust of yourself on the house. So he was the one who owned the house, and then he gave it to his oldest son, Gifford, who became governor of Pennsylvania and the first head of the U.S. Forestry Service. And now this house was given to the federal government in 1963. So this is the equally attractive back of the house. The tour only takes you like through one half of the first floor. The upper floors are used as offices. So there's nothing to see up there. But the first floor is definitely a visual impact. And this is the back of the house. Impressive from all sides. You can tell from this outbuilding that's built into the side of the hill, it must have been an ice house originally. So that would help it maintain cool temperatures. And I read somewhere that the slate roof, the slate comes from New Jersey. So this used to be their swimming pool, and they filled it in recently in the 2000s. I guess you could use it for weddings. It'd be nice if it was a pool. Of all the features of Grey Towers, I think this table is the most interesting. So people would sit around the table, and then when you passed things, you just would push the bowl or the plate of whatever across the table, like this. Looking at the finger bowl table, where it's a table made out of water, and you push things across to people sitting on the other side. What a great idea. They even had seating area around the table. If you didn't want to be in the middle of the conversation. Here's the entry to Grey Towers. The mansion itself is mostly just open from 12 until 3, but you can come into the grounds from 9 until 4:30. And you can supposedly walk into the property before 9 a.m. And then it's just a regular neighborhood right across the street. Sort of on the western edge of Milford, Pennsylvania. Grey Towers.